Hey girls. Today we are going to be moving away from absolute monarchs and starting our lessons on the Enlightenment. Um, with absolute monarchs, you have a quiz that is due tomorrow night at 11:59. It is 10 questions, and as long as you check out your notes, you shouldn't have a hard time with it. So, with the Enlightenment, you guys are gonna have a worksheet to do. You should do the worksheet kind of before we get into our notes. So I'm just gonna show you it really quick. We can go over it a little bit. Um, where is it? Just one second. Enlightenment. Okay. Oh, here it is. Okay, so um, the Enlightenment was a period of time when people developed new ideas of human existence. So this is when people start to think about basic rights, the level of control they should have over their government and their futures. Um, the Enlightenment began in Europe around 1715. People in cities like Paris gathered in salons to discuss philosophy and ways that they can improve the human experience. Because at this point, everybody is ruled by their absolute monarch, right? When the state has absolute power, which means total power, right? The state can be called totalitarianism. That is when the state has total power or control over its people. Um, and then the leader would be called a totalitarian. Totalitarian. Oh my god. Okay. So so philosophers started to kind of brainstorm and think of ways that they can have more power over the state. Um, this time was referred to as the age of reason, right? Because their ideas are based in science and reason. So John Locke, who is my favorite philosopher, he came up with the idea of natural rights. Um, Enlightenment thinkers believe that human beings were born with fundamental basic rights. These are natural rights. We know that in our Declaration of Independence and in our U.S. Constitution that every man has unalienable rights that cannot be violated by any government, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, also known as property. So, in order for people to be able to enjoy their natural rights, other rights must be protected. Um, we can think of these other rights as including speech, expression, um, right to a fair trial, those kinds of things that we also see in our Constitution. So John Locke comes up with the social contract theory, right? When there's no government at all, people are running around wild, no one's held accountable for their actions. This is called the state of nature. There are no rules and it's complete freedom. Think about it. There aren't any rules that say that the lion is not allowed to kill the gazelle, right? It's every man for himself. And the fittest in society or the strongest are going to be successful and get what they want. For example, a hyena in a safari would attack a gazelle, but that doesn't mean that the hyena is the most powerful in the food chain because there will always be someone stronger and more powerful, such as the lion. So there's no protection from one another in the state of nature, right? So John Locke comes up with this idea about the social contract. They say, hey, how about you give up some of your freedom so that you can be protected by the state, right? Um, so, for example, now you can't rob anybody to get what you want, and you can't kill people to get what you want. However, you're giving up this right so that the government can protect you from being killed by someone else. Okay? Um, to the Enlightenment thinkers, they believed that the relationship between the government and the citizens living in it was an agreement. The citizens agree to obey a set of rules, so the government agrees to protect their rights. That's pretty much how it works. Enlightenment thinkers also believed that governments had a responsibility to hold up their end of the social contract. And if the government failed, this is a super, super important key concept, right? If the government fails to protect the citizens' rights, citizens no longer agree to be governed, and they would have the right to revolt or to overthrow. So, for example, in our country right now, let's say, the president started, ordering for the deaths of, you know, anybody who didn't wear a mask in society, right? That can't happen because the government is responsible for protecting our rights. In that sense, citizens of the United States would have the right to overthrow the government of the United States. Um, Typically, the government protects its people from foreign invaders, but it also had absolute authority over the people, right? So the kings ruled the citizens whether they liked it or not. Enlightenment thinkers said, this can't continue. So, we had European leaders that were in power because their father was in power, whose father was in power, and they justified their authority because of divine right. They are second at the hand of God, and God called them to rule, and that's just the way things were. And no one questioned religion because the church was so powerful. Um, Enlightenment thinkers believed in republicanism, and this is an idea that a country's leader should be chosen by the citizens in an election. Um, so even though democracy is an idea that we ultimately adopted in the United States, democracy was frowned upon by some Enlightenment thinkers because they didn't trust the masses, meaning all of the people in society, to vote. They didn't believe that the uneducated members of society could be held responsible to elect their leader. So that was a problem. And this idea of republicanism was brought about by Montesquieu. Um, so Rousseau, Montesquieu, Locke, they become super famous and they influence leaders in Europe. They also become popular, obviously, with the Americans who wanted independence. And when our founding fathers created a government for the new US, they embraced many of these Enlightenment ideas, like I had mentioned throughout this conversation, like natural rights, rights of the governed, the social contract theory. Um, America's Constitution recognizes that the citizens are born with basic rights. And while some founders were concerned about democracy, that is ultimately the regime that we adopted, and it still governs our society today. So, if you could please just do this. I understand that the crossword might be a little difficult, but if you could just on a Word doc as part of your submission for today, you know, just kind of copy what's going on here, the across and then the down, and you can label it number 2, 4, 6, or you can just do straight through 1 through 12. Doesn't bother me. Um, and then you can just type this up here, your answers to this question. Okay. So that's what I have for your intro for the Enlightenment and that worksheet. I would like you to read that through again and do that first. Um, so let's just look at the Enlightenment in general. Okay, so we already know about all the English monarchs. We looked at them, right? Here they are. 1 second. What did I do? Okay. Right. We have Henry the Seventh, we have Henry the Eighth, we have Arthur. From Henry the Eighth comes Elizabeth. Um, we know that Henry the Eighth transformed England because his wife wouldn't bear him a son, and so he had a series of wives, and whenever they didn't produce a son, he would behead them, what have you. Um, there was conflict over whether England should be a Protestant state or a Catholic state. Elizabeth kind of found a happy medium and was able to kind of satisfy everybody, whereas her sister Mary um, was coined as Bloody Mary, and she executed Protestants. After Mary's death, Elizabeth became queen. She was one of the greatest English monarchs. She accepted the idea of the constitutional monarchy. Okay, Elizabeth agrees um, to having parliament. Parliament is the legislative group of commoners who work with the lords, and they're still around today. Um, there are quite a few parliamentary systems globally today. The Magna Carta was created to limit the monarch. This is unheard of in an absolute monarchy, considering the leader has absolute power. So that's kind of, what was happening in England at this time. So let's go back to the Enlightenment. Okay, so let's find out what the key ideas of Enlightenment are. So European philosophers begin thinking about old ideas about government, religion, economics. This leads to the Age of Reason. Um, Intellectuals of the Enlightenment were called philosophers, and they shared a lot of the same basic beliefs. New truths could be discovered by logic and reason. Everything can be explained by observing universal truths known as natural laws. Um, they believed in progress and that the world can be improved and that people should enjoy life. Um, People are born with natural rights. That was something I had just talked about. So notice that new truths and discoveries found by logic and reason. Um, Everything can be explained using universal truths known as natural laws. This totally goes against or contradicts the idea of an absolute monarch and their power, because an absolute monarch rules society and just tells everyone what to do. And also, an absolute monarch claims that his right to rule comes from God, right? So we're going to the Age of Reason kind of steers away from religion as the universal truth and looks more towards logic and reason. So we can see how an absolute monarchy could kind of start to fall apart at this point when people start to question why things in society happen. This kind of reminds us about the scientific revolution that we saw. So why did the Enlightenment begin? You guys remember that top left picture, the bottom picture underneath that, right? During the Renaissance, people began to question medieval ideas. They emphasized humanism and encouraged education. During the Age of Exploration, trade routes led Europeans to search for new things. During the Protestant Reformation, people began to question church teachings. And during the Age of Absolute Monarchs, kings spent lavishly, just like Louis XIV with the Palace of Versailles, and fought expensive wars and ruled without regard to their nation's people. During the scientific revolution, scholars applied logic, perfected the scientific method, and made new discoveries that shattered old ideas. For example, when they thought that the earth was flat, right? Advancements in modern medicine, things of that nature. So the Enlightenment key ideas or concepts talk about people trying to apply the scientific approach to all aspects of society. Political scientists are proposing new ideas about government. Philosophies advocate the use of reason to discover truths, and they address social issues through reason. So, the right to govern. The old idea is that a monarch's rule is justified by divine right, meaning that, we already went over this, but meaning that their right to govern is given to them by God. Whereas this new idea says that a government's power should come from the consent of the governed. When you cast your vote for president, or when you cast your vote for state representative, for mayor, for governor, whatever office you're casting your vote for, you are saying, I want this person to rule, or I want this person to govern, and I give them my consent to govern. Okay? Even if the person that you vote for doesn't win, you are still voting and participating in the system that selects the best governor or the best person to govern. Okay? So you're still giving the state and the system the authority to govern you, or in other words, your consent. So Thomas Hobbes, he's the guy who came up with the idea of the state of nature. He was bothered by the English Civil War and chaos that plagued England after King Charles I was beheaded. And so he believed that humans are naturally cruel, selfish, and hungry for power. And he argued that people need to be protected from themselves. He described the life in the state of nature as nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So again, we're going to think about the idea of, the gazelle, the hyena, and the lion, right? The gazelle doesn't stand a chance because it's the weakest in society. The hyena is stronger than the gazelle and so takes down the gazelle. However, the lion can always overpower the hyena. This chain, no one can be protected from the next strongest person. So instead of living in fear without law to protect you from the person next to you, okay, Hobbes says, you know what? The people need to be protected from themselves. They cannot be trusted. They are they are cruel. They are violent, right? So, what kind of government do you think Hobbes is going to support if he has this idea or this outlook on human life? He supported the rule of absolute monarchs. He thought that they were the best fit for the job. He said that only kings with absolute power could maintain order in such a violent society. Okay, so that was his idea. He believed in the social contract, but he thought that people should give up all of their power and all of their rights to be protected by a king who would provide law and order. People don't go around killing people in an absolute monarchy. Why? Because they're terrified of the monarch. That was the idea that Hobbes supported. People could only be trusted to behave in society if they were fearful of an absolute ruler. This ruler that Hobbes is talking about, this powerful person, he calls this the Leviathan. You don't have to know about that, but whatever. So, English philosopher John Locke disagrees with the idea of Thomas Hobbes. If you remember in my classroom, this guy is framed. Um, he was influenced by the Glorious Revolution when the Bill of Rights was created in England to protect citizens' rights. We have the Magna Carta, we have the English Bill of Rights. These all take place in England that kind of step away from the monarchy and give more rights to the people. So he believed that people are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. That's weird. We see that in our government's documents. Interesting. Locke did not believe the same way that Hobbes did that the people had to give up all power to the government or to an absolute ruler. He argued that there should be a balance, right? People will have to give up some of their rights to the ruler, but not all of them. Um, he argued that the kings could be overthrown if they violated the people's rights, like I talked about earlier. So, what kind of government do we think Locke supports? He supported a limited or constitutional monarchy, right? We remember that Queen Elizabeth had a constitutional monarchy. He believed that power came from the consent of the governed, approval of the people, and that kings should protect the rights of people. Okay, so um, in your document, I'm going to ask you to write down the answer to this question. You can pause the video or what have you. And in your document where you did your crossword puzzle, I want you to complete this writing prompt. Whose ideas are right, Hobbes or Locke? So you can pause, do whatever you want. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of these philosophers, right? Political ideas. So the French philosopher Voltaire was one of the most famous writers of the Enlightenment. He argued for the rights of freedom of speech, religion, and he criticized intolerance, prejudice, and oppression. He was jailed twice in France for criticizing the government. However, his letters to European monarchs helped introduce new reforms and freedoms. Okay. You don't have to do this one. Political ideas of the Enlightenment. So, Baron de Montesquieu agreed with John Locke that the government should protect individual rights and liberties, and that if there is too much power, it can lead to tyranny. Um, Montesquieu believed in the separation of powers. This is where we get the idea of the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. This was formed by Montesquieu. Okay, so um, you guys, we looked at this when we were looking at ancient Greece and Rome and comparing it to society today. Montesquieu's model of government also included a system of checks and balances. And this is what we see as well, how everybody checks the next person. They have checks. For example, the executive branch's check on the legislative branch is the power to veto. Um, the judicial branch's check on the legislative branch is judicial review. And I'm trying to think. Basically, also, Congress can shoot down a presidential veto as well. So then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed in individual freedom. He believed that people are naturally good, however, power corrupts them. He has this idea of a social contract and that the government is based on the common good. He argued for a direct democracy because he trusted the people, right? We're going to stop here. We'll start here next time just because I feel like you guys have enough to do already. So you have that quiz that is due on Thursday, tomorrow night at 11:59. Don't forget it. If you have any questions or you need clarification, please let me know. You can also use your textbook as a resource if you have it. If you need any pages, let me know and I can send them to you. Yeah, email me with any questions, girls.